A man they never saw. A contract that could destroy everything, and one impossible night that changed both their lives forever. The janitor pushed his cart past the glass doors of the 42nd floor boardroom at 11:47 p.m., and the most powerful woman in the building laughed at him. Not because he had done anything wrong, because she was desperate, exhausted, and needed someone to blame. What she didn't know was that the quiet man holding the mop had spent years inside the exact kind of document threatening to swallow her company whole. She pointed at him as a joke. He walked through those doors and sat down. That was her first mistake. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you're still here by the end, hit that like button. It means everything. The elevator opened onto the 42nd floor at 11:31 p.m., and Ethan Brooks stepped out into the kind of silence that only exists in office buildings after everyone with a salary worth talking about has gone home. He paused for a second in the hallway, the way he always did, just to take stock of the night ahead. The cleaning cart sat where he'd left it by the supply closet, the right rear wheel still wobbling after 6 months of requests to maintenance that had gone nowhere. He gripped the handle, gave it a push, and listened to the familiar squeak as he headed toward the south corridor. Floor 42 was one of the better floors to work. Fewer individual offices meant fewer individual messes. The partners at the law firm on 38 were the worst. Coffee cups left open on the carpet. Takeout containers not even aimed at the trash bin, like the act of throwing things away was somehow beneath them. Floor 42 was mostly open-plan desks and 2 large conference rooms, and the people who worked here at least seemed to understand that other human beings had to clean up after them. Most nights, anyway. Ethan started with the far end, the way he always did, working backward toward the elevator bank. He had a system. Not because anyone had told him to develop one, but because having a system was the only way to get through 8 hours of work without it blurring into something that started to feel like it had no end. He wiped down the row of desks along the east window. Manhattan spread out below him, the grid of lit windows and dark patches, the red taillights of cabs moving down Lexington. A construction crane lit up an orange safety light 6 blocks north, motionless in the night. He'd stopped really seeing the view months ago. It was just there, the way walls are just there. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He already knew what the text would say before he pulled it out. "Dad, the nebulizer is making that sound again." I turned it off. "I'm okay. I just wanted you to know." He typed back quickly, leaning the mop against the desk. "I'll look at it when I get home. Don't mess with it. You breathing all right?" 3 dots appeared, then, "Yes. I took the blue one before bed like you said." "Good. Go to sleep. I'll be home by 7. "Okay. Love you." "Love you too, bud." He put the phone back in his pocket and stood there for a second with his hand still pressed against the outside of his jacket. 8 years old, and the kid already knew which inhaler was the blue one and which was the orange one and what the difference was between them. Knew how to use the nebulizer on his own. Knew not to panic when it made the rattling noise that meant the internal tube was starting to separate from the connector piece. Lucas had been 3 years old when his mother was diagnosed. He'd spent 2 years watching Ethan learn how to navigate hospital corridors, insurance forms, and the specific language of people who delivered bad news without ever quite saying it directly. By the time Lucas started school, he already understood, in the wordless way children sometimes understand things before they have language for them, that life required a kind of vigilance most kids his age didn't know existed. Ethan didn't love that his son had learned that lesson so early, but he'd stopped feeling guilty about it somewhere around the time Lucas had calmly talked him through what to say to the insurance company when they tried to reclassify the nebulizer as a non-essential piece of equipment. 8 years old. The kid had overheard enough phone calls to know the language. He pushed the cart forward and kept moving. He was halfway through the second conference room to the smaller one, the one they used for internal meetings, when the noise started. It came from behind the double doors of the main boardroom at the far end of the hall. Not loud at first. The low-register drone of multiple voices all trying to talk at once. The kind of sound that could belong to a late meeting running over or a bad phone call on speaker. But then a single voice cut through the rest of it. Sharp, clipped. The kind of voice that was used to being the loudest one in the room even when it wasn't trying to be. "That is not acceptable. None of this is acceptable. Someone tell me where Hartman is." A pause. Then another voice, male, softer. He's not answering. His assistant said he left Frankfurt 6 hours ago and they haven't. I don't care about his assistant. The sharp voice again. I care about the fact that we have 14 hours until the markets open in Berlin and nobody in this building can read this document without Hartman. Ethan slowed without meaning to. He knew the boardroom. He cleaned it 3 nights a week. Long oval table, 16 chairs, a wall of glass on one side looking out over Midtown, a presentation screen on the other wall that was always left on standby and that someone always forgot to turn off, which was a small point of irritation because the amber standby light created a shadow line right down the center of the table that made it hard to see if the surface was actually clean. He knew who used it. Sterling Global occupied the top 4 floors of the building, and the boardroom on 42 was where the serious work happened. He knew the CEO by sight. Olivia Sterling, 30 years old, had taken over from her father 18 months ago, always the last one out of the building most nights. Coffee cup left on the right side of the table closest to the head chair, lipstick mark on the rim, never quite rinsed. He knew her the way you know anyone you clean up after, not personally, but in the specific and slightly intimate way of knowing someone's habits when they aren't performing for anyone. He'd never spoken to her. He'd never spoken to any of them. He was furniture that moved. He told himself to keep going, keep moving south toward the elevator, hit the bathrooms, clock out at 6:15, get home in time to make Lucas's breakfast before the school bus came at 7:40. That was the plan. The plan was the thing. But the voice behind the doors had shifted now, and he heard something in it that made him stop entirely. Not anger. He'd heard enough real anger to know the difference. This was something closer to the edge of panic trying to hold itself together with the pure force of someone who had never allowed themselves to panic in front of other people and wasn't going to start now. If we cannot verify the terms of this acquisition by 9 a.m., we do not have an acquisition. We have a lawsuit and a press release that destroys 6 years of positioning. So I'm asking one more time, is there anyone in this building who speaks German, legal German, not conversational? Silence. Ethan stood in the hallway outside the double doors with his hand on the cart handle and the floor buffer switched off and the whole floor quiet except for whatever was happening in that room. He should have kept walking. Later, he would think about that. The exact moment where the easier path was still available to him, where he could have pushed the cart another 20 feet and let whatever was happening inside that room remain inside that room. He didn't keep walking. He knocked. It wasn't loud, just 2 short raps, the way he always knocked before entering a room where a meeting might still be going on. Cautious. Announcing himself. The knock of someone who understood their position. The voice on the other side said, "What?" He pushed the door open 6 inches and looked in. There were 9 people in the room. 8 of them were seated around the oval table, all in varying states of dishevelment, jackets off, sleeves rolled, that particular exhausted look that comes from people who have been inside the same room wrestling with the same problem for hours without resolution. The 9th person was standing at the head of the table. Olivia Sterling was exactly as he'd seen her before. Dark hair pulled back, suit jacket still on despite the hour, a posture that communicated she had not sat down in some time and was not planning to. She was holding a thick document, bound maybe 60 or 70 pages, the cover page dense with German text. Her expression when she looked toward the door was not unfriendly exactly. It was the expression of someone who had been interrupted at the absolute worst possible moment and was waiting to find out if the interruption was worth tolerating. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Ethan said. I just wanted to check if the room needed anything." "The room needs a translator," said the man seated closest to the door. He had the loosened tie and hollow eyes of someone's general counsel. He said it flatly, not cruelly, just as a statement of fact about the universe's fundamental indifference to their situation. There was a small, ugly sound from somewhere in the middle of the table, a half laugh, someone saying under their breath, "Maybe ask the janitor." Ethan didn't look toward the sound. He looked at Olivia Sterling because she was the one who'd been talking. She looked back at him for a moment. Whatever she was reading in his face, he couldn't tell. Then the corner of her mouth moved in the way mouths move when someone has decided to make a joke out of something that is causing them genuine distress, because it's better than the alternative. "You know what?" she said, with the specific, bladed lightness of a person who had stopped caring about decorum 20 minutes ago. Why not? Can you read German? The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Ethan looked at the document in her hands. Depends on what kind, he said. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. He could see it move through the room, the slight recalibration, the way people's faces did the math and came up short. Olivia Sterling tilted her head a fraction of an inch. What do you mean, what kind? I mean there's a difference between standard German and legal German. And there's a difference between contemporary legal German and the particular framework used in cross-border acquisition documents drafted under German corporate law. He paused. Which one is that? Nobody said anything. He nodded at the document. Can I see the cover page? She didn't hand it to him immediately. She looked at him for a moment, not the way she'd looked at him before, when he'd just been the shape of a person in the doorway. This was something more considered. Then she crossed the room and held the document out. He took it. The cover page read, Übernahmevertrag zwischen der Kellner Industrie GmbH under Sterling Global Holdings, Inc. Entwurf zur abschließenden Prüfung. He read it twice, which wasn't because he needed to. It was because he wanted to make sure he was reading the specific legal template it was derived from before he said anything. This is a draft acquisition agreement between Kellner Industrie GmbH and Sterling Global Holdings, he said. It's structured under the GmbH acquisition framework with cross-jurisdictional provisions for U.S. regulatory compliance. The language is German Corporate Legal Standard, post-2019 Reform Edition. The room was absolutely silent. Can you read it? Olivia said. Her voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but stripped of the performance. Just the question, asked straight. Yes, Ethan said. All of it? All of it. She looked at him for another 3 seconds. He watched her make a decision, watched it happen in real time, the way her jaw shifted slightly and her shoulders dropped 1 centimeter, and her hand moved to pull out the chair nearest to the door. Sit down, she said. He sat down. The executives watched him the way people watch someone perform a card trick they're already preparing to dismiss as sleight of hand. The man with the loosened tie, he introduced himself as Richard Park, General Counsel, pushed a legal pad across the table without comment. Someone else produced a pen. Ethan picked it up, turned to page 1 of the document, and started reading. He read the first clause aloud, translating it in one clean pass. The formal identification of parties, the subject matter of the agreement, the governing law provision. His German was unhurried. The translation was immediate, without the pauses and restarts that come from someone piecing a language together in real time. After 2 minutes, nobody was looking at their phones. After 5 minutes, Richard Park had pulled his legal pad back and was writing. After 10 minutes, the man at the far end of the table, late 50s, silver hair, the particular stillness of someone with either enormous patience or enormous anxiety, leaned forward and said quietly to the woman beside him, "Where did they find this person?" "He's the janitor," she said, just as quietly. "I know who he is," the man said. "That's not what I asked." Ethan kept reading. The document was 63 pages. He worked through it methodically, section by section, pausing at certain passages to give not just the translation but the legal context, explaining when a specific clause invoked a provision of the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, clarifying when a term of art in German corporate law had no clean English equivalent and required a functional description rather than a direct translation. Olivia Sterling had stopped standing. Somewhere around page 12, she had sat down in the chair across from him. Not the head chair, just a regular chair, which he suspected was unusual for her. And she was reading her own copy of the document alongside his translation, tracking his work against the German text with a focus that suggested she was trying, on some level, to verify him. She couldn't verify the German, but she could verify whether his interpretation was internally consistent, whether his legal framing matched what their own counsel would recognize, whether the picture he was building made structural sense. He could see her building that verification in real time. It was, he thought, not unlike watching someone solve a problem. The same quality of focused attention, The same slight movement of the pen when she found something that correlated. Around page 22, Ethan paused. It wasn't a dramatic pause. He didn't set the document down or lean back. He just stopped mid-sentence and reread the clause he'd just encountered, and then turned back 4 pages to cross-reference a provision he'd translated 20 minutes earlier. Richard Park noticed. "What is it?" "Give me a second." He turned to page 31, then back to page 8. He made a note on the legal pad. 3 lines, then a bracket with a page number, then another note below it. "What's wrong?" Olivia asked. "I'm not sure yet," he said, which wasn't quite true but was easier than explaining what he thought he was seeing before he was certain he was seeing it. He turned another page, found what he was looking for. The room had gone very still. There's a cross-reference between the indemnification provision on page 8 and a supplemental schedule in Annex C that doesn't appear on the table of contents, he said. The language in the main body says the acquiring party assumes financial responsibility for, and I'm quoting directly here, alle bestehenden und zukünftigen Verbindlichkeiten, die im ergänzenden Anhang C aufgeführt sind. Which means, Richard Park said, all existing and future liabilities enumerated in supplemental Annex C. He looked up. There's no Annex C in this document. Silence. "What?" Olivia said. "The table of contents lists Annexes A and B. There is no Annex C in the document you were given, but the main body refers to it and makes Sterling Global's financial responsibility contingent on whatever's in it." He paused. The acquiring party would be signing a blanket assumption of liability for a document they've never seen. Richard Park stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the credenza behind him. "Is that the only instance?" Olivia's voice was measured, but her knuckles, Ethan noticed, had gone white around the pen she was holding. "No," he said. "There are 2 more. Can you turn to page 37 and page 51? The next 40 minutes were the opposite of the previous 10. The previous 10 had been the specific, controlled tension of people watching someone do something they hadn't expected and trying to determine if it was real. The next 40 minutes were the kind of movement that happens when a room full of professionals suddenly understands they are standing on the edge of something catastrophic. Richard Park was on his feet, phone to his ear, trying to reach someone at their outside legal firm. The silver-haired man, whose name Ethan eventually gathered, was Thomas Wren, chief financial officer, had opened a laptop and was scrolling through a parallel version of the document that had been sent as a digital file, confirming that the same language appeared there. The woman beside him was on a separate call, speaking in the quick professional shorthand of someone delivering urgent information to someone else who knew how to receive it. Ethan kept translating. He worked through the remaining pages with the same pace he'd maintained from the beginning, because the pace was the thing. Consistency, letting the work be the work. Olivia Sterling had not moved from her chair. She was watching him, not with the calculating measurement of the first 20 minutes. Something different. He couldn't have named it exactly. He wasn't trying to. He was trying to finish reading a 63-page acquisition document at 11:50 in the evening while an entire executive team tried to reconstruct the implications of what he'd found. "Page 54, he said. "There's another provision. This one is subtler. The language describes the technology transfer clause, and on first read it appears to grant Sterling global licensing rights to Kellner's core proprietary systems. But there's a subordinate clause, vorbehaltlich der im ursprünglichen Eigentumsregister eingetragenen Rechte, which translates roughly to subject to the rights registered in the original ownership registry. That's a carve-out. It means Kellner retains the actual ownership of any technology that was registered before the date of this agreement." Richard Park had come back to the table. "Which is everything," he said flatly. "Which is everything that makes the acquisition valuable," Ethan confirmed. "You would be paying the acquisition price for licensing rights to technology you don't own, while assuming the liabilities associated with the full ownership of the business." Thomas Wren made a sound that Ethan suspected was the closest this particular man ever came to expressing what he was actually feeling. "How long did you know?" Olivia asked. He looked up. She wasn't asking how long he'd known about the document. She was asking when he'd first seen the first trap. "Page 22, he said. "The Annex C reference. I wanted to confirm the pattern before I said anything." She nodded, just once, slowly. "Finish it," she said, "all of it." He finished it. By 1:15 a.m., Ethan had translated all 63 pages, and the room had a complete picture of what they were actually dealing with. The fraudulent acquisition structure was comprehensive. Someone at Kellner Industry had worked with considerable legal sophistication to construct a document that appeared on standard review in English to be a straightforward corporate acquisition with above-average complexity. The traps were embedded in the German legal framework at a level that required not just fluency, but specialized knowledge of GmbH acquisition conventions and the specific cross-referencing patterns used in German corporate legal drafting. This wasn't an oversight, Richard Park said. He had a yellow highlighter in his hand, and he had used most of it. This was deliberate. Yes, Ethan said. The hidden liabilities. Do we have any estimate on exposure? Thomas Wren asked. Not without Annex C, Richard Park said, which is, of course, the point. The technology carve-out alone would have avoided most of the acquisition's value, Ethan said. The licensing structure they've set up would have given Sterling Global the appearance of owning the Kellner IP portfolio, while Kellner retained actual legal title. In 3 to 5 years, they could have exercised those retained rights and effectively forced Sterling Global into either a renegotiated arrangement or litigation. On terms entirely in their favor, Thomas Wren said. On terms entirely in their favor. Olivia Sterling stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the table for a moment, looking out at the city. Nobody spoke. Ethan watched her shoulders rise once, slowly, and fall. Then she turned around. Richard, she said, I want this documented. Every provision, every cross-reference, everything Ethan found. I want it formatted for legal review by 6 a.m., and I want our litigation partner on the phone at 7:30. She looked down the table. Marcus, draft a communication to Kellner's board that says the deal is suspended pending further review. Don't say fraud. Don't say anything specific. Just suspended pending review. I want to control the timeline on this. Understood. Thomas, recalculate our position under the original valuation framework, assuming the technology carve-out. I want to know what the asset was actually worth to us. Already started. She looked around the table. Everyone else go home. Get 4 hours. I need you back here at 8. She paused. Thank you. People began to move. The sound of the room changed, the gathering of papers, the clicking of laptop latches, the specific weight of a crisis deferred rather than resolved. Ethan had begun to stack the papers he'd been working from into a neat pile. He was trying to remember if he'd finished the second conference room before he'd knocked on the door, or if he'd still had the east window section left. Hey. He looked up. Olivia Sterling was standing at the other end of the table, and everyone else had either left the room or was in the process of leaving. She had her arms crossed. Not defensively, he thought, more like someone holding something in. What's your name? She said. Ethan, he said. Brooks. You've been working this floor for how long? About 8 months? She was quiet for a moment, then, Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you know what was in this room tonight? What this deal meant? He thought about it. A $2.1 billion acquisition was how I heard it described in the hallway about 3 weeks ago when your M&A team was doing their site walk. She didn't react to that, which was interesting. That's right, $2.1 billion. And the debt exposure in that hidden annex. She stopped. We don't know what that number is, but our outside firm is going to tell me tomorrow morning that it's north of $400 million. He didn't say anything. You saved this company tonight, she said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a statement of fact that she was still reconciling herself to. A man I didn't know, whose name I didn't know, who I've walked past in this hallway. I don't know how many times. Happens, Ethan said. Not to me, she said. Things like this don't happen to me. He wasn't sure what to say to that. He picked up the legal pad with his notes on it and held it out to her. You'll want this for Richard's documentation. She took it. She looked down at the handwriting. Neat, dense, the annotations cross-referenced with small arrows and page numbers. She didn't say anything for a moment. Where did you learn German legal? She asked. Not do you speak German? Not the generic version of the question. The specific one. He was quiet for a second. Then, graduate program, Germanic Law and Linguistics, NYU. About 10 years ago. She looked up. I was a researcher, he said, specialized in legal translation for cross-border corporate instruments, GmbH structures specifically, which is why I recognized the framework tonight. He paused. I left before I finished the doctorate. Why? He looked at her for a moment, this 30-year-old woman who ran a billion-dollar company, who had held it together tonight with visible effort and very few cracks in the surface, who was now asking him a personal question in an empty boardroom at 1:20 in the morning, like she was entitled to the answer. He decided she'd probably earned at least part of it. Personal reasons, he said. She seemed to recognize that as the version of the answer she was going to get tonight. Ethan Brooks, she said. Not asking, just repeating it, the way people do when they're committing something to memory. That's me, he said. She nodded, then, thank you. Good luck with Kellner, he said. He picked up his cart handle and pushed it out of the boardroom, back into the corridor, the wheels squeaking in the quiet hallway. The city still spread out below the windows on his left as he moved toward the elevator. He was 11 minutes behind schedule. He'd have to move faster on the bathrooms if he wanted to hit the basement supply room before 6. His phone buzzed again. Dad, you up? He smiled, which he almost never did at work, and typed back, You should be asleep. I was. Had a dream. You okay? I'm good, bud. Go back to sleep. Okay. Love you. Love you too. He put the phone away and hit the button for the bathroom corridor. The city glittered 42 stories below, indifferent and enormous, the way cities always are. Somewhere in it, Olivia Sterling was calling her litigation partner. Somewhere in Frankfurt, a man named Kellner was sleeping without knowing that a janitor had just read his trap and named every piece of it in clean, fluent translation. Ethan pushed the cart around the corner and got back to work. The floor wasn't going to clean itself. The building's security log showed Ethan Brooks had badged out at 6:18 a.m. Olivia Sterling knew this because she'd asked Marcus, her executive assistant, to pull the overnight access records at 8:30 that morning while she was standing at the window with her third coffee and a legal pad covered in her own handwriting. She wasn't sure why she'd asked. She hadn't done anything with the information once she had it. She'd just looked at the timestamp, 6:18 a.m., and done the math. He'd worked until 6 in the morning, translated 63 pages of sophisticated legal German in the middle of the night, and then gone home. Like it was a normal Tuesday. She turned away from the window. The conference room was full again, different configuration than the night before. Outside legal counsel had sent 2 partners and an associate, all of them in suits that suggested they'd gone home, slept 3 hours, and come back with the specific energy of people billing at $400 an hour. Richard Park looked like he hadn't slept at all, which was more or less accurate. Thomas Wren had a spreadsheet open on his laptop, and the expression of a man working through numbers he didn't fully want to believe. Walk me through the exposure, Olivia said. Thomas turned the laptop to face the room. Based on what we can reconstruct from the language in the main body, the liability assumption clause referencing Annex C, our outside firm estimates the hidden debt package at somewhere between $380 million and $460 million. We won't have a precise number until we either obtain Annex C through legal process or Kellner discloses it voluntarily. They're not going to disclose it voluntarily, one of the outside partners said. No, Olivia agreed. They're not. The technology carve-out is a separate issue, the other partner said. The subordinate clause the translator identified creates a clean legal pathway for Kellner to challenge ownership of the primary IP assets within their first window. Based on standard GmbH provisions, that window opens 36 months post-close. So we would have owned a company for 3 years before they pulled the floor out, Richard said. Essentially. Olivia stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. She picked up a marker, uncapped it, and wrote 2 numbers, $2.1 billion and $400 million plus. Then she drew a line between them. That's the delta between what we thought we were buying and what we would have actually bought, she said. And that assumes the technology retention clause only affects the primary portfolio. If it extends to the subsidiary licenses, it does, the associate said, looking at her notes. The subordinate clause language is broad enough to cover the full IP architecture. Then the acquisition would have had negative intrinsic value within 5 years, Thomas said. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. How did their legal team not catch this? Richard asked. It came out half-directed at the outside counsel. The senior partner, the one who hadn't spoken yet, a woman in her 50s named Eleanor Voss, who had been reading the annotated translation Ethan had produced while everyone else was talking, looked up and said carefully, "Because whoever drafted this knew exactly how to hide it." She set the document down. The Annex C reference is embedded in a clause that reads, "On first pass, like standard boilerplate." The liability language is almost identical to what you'd see in a clean acquisition agreement. The deviation is a single subordinate phrase that redirects the scope. If you're reading quickly, looking for the big structural elements, you don't slow down for it. And the technology clause? Richard asked. The same technique. The carve-out is buried in a dependent clause that trails a legitimate licensing provision. The main clause reads correctly. You have to read the subordinate syntax to find it. She paused. This was drafted by someone with very specific expertise in German corporate legal structure and its particular vulnerabilities from an English language review perspective. Meaning they knew the document would be reviewed primarily in English, Olivia said. Meaning they counted on it. Olivia capped the marker. Then they also assumed we wouldn't have anyone who could read the German version with the necessary depth. She looked down at the legal pad in front of her. They were almost right. Mick. The meeting ran until 11. By the end of it, the acquisition was formally suspended, and the outside firm had been retained to pursue preliminary fraud discovery. Eleanor Voss and her team had left with copies of everything. The timeline was cautious. They didn't have Annex C, which meant they didn't have the full picture, which meant they needed to build their case around what they did have before engaging Kellner directly. Olivia stayed in the conference room after everyone else had left. She sat at the table with a cold cup of coffee and the annotated legal pad. Ethan's legal pad, the one he'd filled with notes during the translation. She'd been looking at it on and off all morning, not reading it exactly, just looking. The handwriting was careful without being precise, the kind of handwriting that suggested someone who had spent years taking dense technical notes and had developed a system for it. Abbreviations that were internally consistent, cross-references marked with small notations, the occasional underline where a word in German had been left transliterated rather than translated because the English equivalent was insufficient. She flipped to the page where he'd first flagged the Annex C reference. He'd written, liability scope, indefinite. Annex C not present. See page 8, indemnification. And then, beneath it, a bracket with an arrow pointing to a question mark. A question mark. Not an exclamation point, not a flag or an alarm. A question mark. He had seen something that should have set off every alarm bell in the room, and his first response had been to write a question mark and keep reading because he wanted to be sure. She closed the legal pad. Marcus knocked and opened the door. You asked me to remind you about the 11:30. I know. She stood up. Marcus said, can you find out if Ethan Brooks is on shift tonight? Marcus blinked. Yes. I can check with building operations. Do that. Ethan showed up at the 42nd floor at 11:20 that night, the same time he always did, and found an envelope taped to the door of the supply closet with his name on it. He stood there for a second, holding the wobbling cart handle, looking at the envelope. His name was written in a handwriting he didn't recognize, clean and slightly forward-leaning, the E in Ethan starting with more pressure than the rest. He opened it. Inside was a single index card. It read, when you have a few minutes, come to my office. O. Sterling. And then, below that, in slightly different ink, like it had been added after, not urgent, only if you have time. He read it twice. Then he tucked it into his jacket pocket and pushed the cart toward the south corridor. He had learned a long time ago not to react to things until he understood what they were. A note taped to a supply closet door could mean a lot of things. It could mean a thank you. It could mean a conversation he didn't want to have. It could mean someone who felt like they owed him something and was trying to discharge the debt in the easiest way available. He'd deal with it after the second conference room. He found her office at 12:40 when he'd finished the south corridor and the bathrooms and the small kitchen area on the north end of the floor. Her office was in the corner, glass walls on two sides, looking out over the city, which was still going the way the city always was going at 12:40 in the morning, which was to say it never quite stopped. The lights inside were on. She was at her desk, jacket off, reading something on her laptop, and she looked up when he knocked on the glass. She waved him in. He came in about 3 feet and stopped. "You wanted to see me." "Sit down," she said. "I'm good standing." She looked at him for a second. "Fair enough?" She closed her laptop. "I wanted to say a few things." "Okay." "Formally. Not the way I said them last night, which was in the middle of—" She paused. "A lot of things happening at once." "You said thank you," he said. That was enough. It wasn't, actually. She stood up, which he hadn't expected. She moved to the front of the desk and leaned against it, which put her at roughly his eye level. "We had a situation last night that could have been catastrophic for this company, and it wasn't because you knocked on a door. And then you did 4 hours of skilled work in the middle of the night without being asked, without any obligation, without—" She stopped. "Without anyone in this room treating you with any particular respect before you started." He didn't say anything. "Including me," she said. "Especially me. You were under a lot of pressure. That's not an excuse." He looked at her for a moment. She said it like she meant it. Not performing contrition, not the corporate version of an apology where the acknowledgement of the thing is used to close the topic. She was just saying it because it was true, which was different. "It's all right," he said. "My team laughed," she said, "when someone made the janitor joke. I let that sit for too long. People do things like that." "I know. I also know that the person I am at 11:30 at night under extreme stress is still the person I actually am, and I let it go too long." She looked at him steadily. "I'm sorry." He nodded. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with a straightforward apology delivered by someone who clearly wasn't used to giving them and was doing it anyway. So he just nodded. "All right," he said. She seemed to read that as acceptance and moved on, which he was grateful for. She picked up a folder from the desk beside her. "I also want to talk to you about your employment situation." I figured that's where this was going. "Does that bother you?" "Depends on what you're going to say." She opened the folder. "I talked to HR this morning about your current contract. You're through a facilities management company, not employed directly by Sterling Global, which means your compensation is set by that contract and doesn't reflect what you demonstrated last night." "I know what my compensation is," he said, without heat. "I know you do." She set the folder down without opening it fully. "I want to know if you'd be interested in a different arrangement." He waited. "We have an international contracts team," she said. 8 people. Their primary function is review, drafting support, and compliance management for our cross-border agreements. We do business in 11 countries, and 4 of those markets, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, require German language legal review that we currently outsource entirely. "To Hartman," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I heard the name last night," he said. "To Hartman's firm." "Yes." "Who was unavailable last night at the precise moment we needed him." She paused. "I'm not proposing anything you're obligated to consider, but I think you should know that what you did last night, that level of specialized legal language work, is not something I can easily replace. We have good people on the international team, but nobody with that specific training." Ethan looked at the window behind her, the city outside going and going. "I don't have a completed doctorate," he said. "I left the program early." "I know. I had someone look at your background this morning." He looked at her sharply. "LinkedIn," she said, "and the NYU graduate program directory. Nothing invasive." She paused. "I found your publication list. 2 journal articles and a co-authored monograph on GmbH acquisition structures and cross-jurisdictional legal translation, published while you were in the program." He didn't say anything. "The monograph is cited in 11 subsequent academic papers," she said, "including one published last year." The room was quiet. Outside, a siren moved up 3rd Avenue, faded, disappeared. "What is it you actually want to offer me?" he said. "A contract review position, senior level, given your demonstrated expertise. International contracts team, focused on the German language markets. The salary is—" She named a figure. He absorbed it. The number was real, not inflated to make the gesture feel bigger. Just what the position actually paid, which was more than he made in a year currently, by a significant margin. Benefits package includes full medical, she said. Comprehensive, for you and any dependents. The medical part was the part that landed. He kept his face the same. He had gotten very good at keeping his face the same. The hours? He said. Standard business hours, 9 to 6, some flex for international time zones. There'd be occasional late nights during active deal cycles, but structured, not open-ended. I need to be available during the day, he said. My son has medical appointments. We have a flex policy. I looked at the HR manual this morning specifically to check. She met his eyes. It's not an exception I'd be making for you. It's standard policy. He looked at her again. She'd checked the HR manual. At some point today, in the middle of dealing with a suspended $2 billion acquisition and outside counsel and board communications, she had looked up the flex policy. He wasn't sure what to do with that either. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. How long do I have? Take a week. He nodded and moved toward the door. Ethan, she said. He stopped. How old is your son? He turned back. 8? What's his name? He hesitated, not because he didn't want to answer. He just wasn't used to people at work asking. Lucas? She nodded. Okay. He left. He was on the subway home, the 5 train running local because of overnight maintenance, the way it always did on Tuesdays, when he let himself actually think about the number she'd mentioned. He did the math in his head. Monthly take-home after taxes versus what he was making now. The delta wasn't just significant. It was the kind of number that solved things. Not all things, but the specific grinding category of things that had been unsolved for long enough to feel permanent. The rent increase his landlord had notified him about in March, which he'd been trying to work around by cutting back on groceries and telling himself it was temporary. The specialist appointment Lucas's pulmonologist had recommended 3 months ago that wasn't covered under the current plan and that Ethan had been putting off. And the comprehensive medical, that was the phrase she'd used. He looked at the darkened window of the subway car, at his own reflection floating there against the tunnel rushing past outside. He thought about the first time Lucas had an asthma attack serious enough to call 911. He'd been 6. Ethan had been at work. Not the night shift then. He'd still been doing early morning custodial at a school in the Bronx. And the call had come from Lucas's after-school program at 7:40 in the morning. He'd run 8 blocks to the subway and then stood in the car with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to the program director tell him the ambulance had come, and Lucas was stable and it was going to be okay. And he'd stood there absolutely still in a moving subway car and done the thing he'd become expert at doing, which was holding the panic completely inside his body without letting any of it reach his face or his hands or his voice. He was still doing that, 8 years in. He'd just gotten very good at it. His phone lit up. A text from his neighbor, Mrs. Cisneros, who had a key and checked in on Lucas some nights when Ethan was running late on the subway. He's asleep. Inhaler is on the nightstand. You're good, he typed back. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. He put the phone in his pocket and watched his reflection in the dark window until the train emerged above ground in the Bronx and the reflection disappeared into the lit-up sky. The next morning, Ethan dropped Lucas off at school and came home to an apartment that felt, in the specific way apartments do at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning, like the problem set of his life laid out in front of him. The nebulizer on the kitchen counter with its cracked connector, the stack of medical bills on the corner of the table that he'd sorted and paperclipped and arranged in order of urgency, which was the kind of organization that felt like control but wasn't. The hole in the living room wall where the baseboard heating had separated from the plaster and the landlord had been promising to fix for 4 months. He sat down at the table with a cup of coffee and opened his laptop. He looked at the NYU graduate program directory for about 15 minutes. Not his old advisor's contact information or any of the resources he'd used when he was enrolled, just the program page, the curriculum, the research areas, the list of current doctoral candidates. He looked at it and felt the particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. He'd been 22 when he'd started the program. He'd been good at it. Not just competent, genuinely good, in the way that occasionally surprised even him. His advisor had used the word exceptional once in a meeting that Ethan had been so startled by he'd laughed, which had been the wrong response. He'd spent 3 years building something, a research focus, a body of work, a sense of where the field might go and what he might contribute to it. And then Mara had gotten sick. He hadn't made the decision to leave all at once. That was the thing about it. There hadn't been a single moment where he'd sat down and decided to trade one life for another. It had happened in increments. First taking a semester off, then deferring the next semester, then working nights so he could be home during the day. Then, at some point he couldn't pin to a specific date, understanding that the deferment had become permanent without ever being formally declared. By the time Mara died, he had been out of the program for 2 years. Lucas had been 4 years old, and the life he'd stepped away from had closed over behind him the way water closes over something dropped into it, quietly, completely, without any visible mark. He didn't regret it. That was the thing he needed to be clear about, to himself. He didn't regret it. Mara had needed him, and then Lucas had needed him. And the work was still there. It still existed, in the journals, in the monograph, in the part of his brain that had parsed 63 pages of fraudulent German legal text at midnight without slowing down. He just hadn't expected anyone to notice. He closed the laptop. He didn't call Olivia Sterling's office that day, or the next day. He worked his shift Thursday night. The 42nd floor was quiet, a few people working late on the south side of the floor, the boardroom dark, Olivia's office light off for the first time he could remember seeing it. He did his work the same way he always did his work. South corridor, conference rooms, bathrooms, kitchen, elevator bank, the squeaking wheel, the low hum of the floor buffer, the city outside the windows doing what the city did. On Friday morning, before he left the building, he stopped at the 42nd floor instead of going straight to the basement to clock out. He found Marcus at his desk outside Olivia's office, already there at 6:15 in the morning, which said something about the kind of schedule she ran. "Is she in?" Ethan said. Marcus looked up. "She's in. Let me check." "It's okay," Olivia said from inside the office. She'd apparently heard his voice. "Send him in." He came in. She was at her desk with the same quality of focus she always seemed to have. 2 windows open on her laptop, a coffee at her elbow, a legal pad with notes. She looked up at him with the kind of look that didn't ask him to explain himself, which he appreciated. "I have some questions," he said. "Okay." The flex policy. If Lucas has an appointment that runs long, what does that actually look like in practice? I don't want the policy version. I want to know how it works day to day. She leaned back in her chair. "Realistically, you tell Marcus you'll be in at noon. You make up the time in the afternoon or at home, depending on the work. Nobody tracks your hours with a stopwatch. We track whether the work is done. And during an active deal cycle, you mentioned late nights. Active cycles are usually 2 to 6 weeks. During those periods, it's more demanding. I try to give people as much warning as possible, but I won't tell you it's always predictable because it's not." She paused. "I won't pretend it's a perfect arrangement. It isn't. It's a real job, with real demands." "I know what a real job is," he said. "I know you do." She met his eyes. "I'm trying to give you accurate information, not sell you on something." He stood there for a moment. "2 more questions," he said. "The benefit start date. Is it immediate or is there a waiting period?" "Immediate for full-time positions at the senior level." "And the reporting structure. I'd be on the international contracts team, which reports to Richard Park, General Counsel." She paused. "And me for cross-border acquisition review." Given last week's situation, I'm restructuring the German market review process to run through a dedicated position rather than outside counsel. He looked at her. "So I'd report to you directly on acquisition work." "Yes." He thought about that for a second. He thought about what it would mean to be in a professional relationship with someone who had laughed, or let someone laugh, and then apologized for it and seemed to mean the apology, and who checked HR manuals at 7 in the morning for a janitor who hadn't decided yet whether to take the job. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll take it?" "Okay, I'll take it," he said. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. He expected her to smile or extend a hand. She did neither. She just nodded, once, the same way she'd nodded the night he'd handed her the legal pad. I'll have Marcus send you the paperwork today. I work until 6, he said. I'll be home by 7. I know your schedule, she said. Not unkindly, just as fact. He nodded back. He walked out of the office, through the corridor, past the boardroom with its dark glass, and the supply closet with the envelope still folded in his jacket pocket, and the cart standing in the hall where he'd left it. And he pushed the button for the elevator and stood there listening to the city come on, outside the 42nd floor windows. He took the cart down in the freight elevator, clocked out at 6:23 a.m. 14 stops on the 5 train, running local. Lucas would be awake by now. He always woke up early on Fridays, some combination of school anticipation and whatever his internal clock had decided was a reasonable hour for the end of the week. He'd probably already eaten something, probably something Ethan had not approved, probably crackers and whatever he'd found in the back of the pantry. Ethan came up out of the subway into the early morning with the light just starting to get serious on the buildings and the street still mostly empty and a specific kind of quiet that only lasts about 40 minutes before the neighborhood woke up completely. He climbed the stairs to the apartment, unlocked the door. Lucas was at the kitchen table in his pajamas, eating crackers. There's cereal, Ethan said. I wanted crackers. You can't survive on crackers. I'm surviving right now, Lucas said, with the specific 8-year-old logic that was impossible to argue with, because it was technically accurate. Ethan sat down across from him and picked up a cracker. Dad, Lucas said, you look different. I'm tired. Not tired different. Different. Ethan looked at his son, 8 years old, eating crackers at 6:30 in the morning, already reading the room the way he'd been reading rooms since he was 4 years old, because that was what life had asked him to do. I got a new job, Ethan said. Lucas stopped chewing. What kind of job? A better one. Lucas looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that were too old for his face. Then he went back to the crackers. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. Lucas shrugged. You're smart. You should have a better job. Ethan looked at his son and felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been braced for a long time against a pressure that was now, slightly, lessening. Eat some actual food, he said. After the crackers, Lucas said. Ethan didn't argue with that. He just sat there in the early morning light while his son ate crackers at the kitchen table, and outside the window the city kept going and something that had been closed for a long time was, very quietly, beginning to open. The paperwork arrived in Ethan's email at 9:47 that Friday morning, while Lucas was at school and Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table trying to sleep with his eyes open, which was something he'd been attempting unsuccessfully for about 40 minutes. He read through the offer letter twice, then a third time, slower, the way he read anything legally significant. Not because he didn't understand it on the first pass, but because understanding something and being certain about it were different things, and he had learned to be certain. The terms were what Olivia had described. Senior Contract Review Specialist, International Division, salary exactly as stated. Benefits effective date of hire. Flex policy listed in the attached handbook, Section 4, Paragraph 3. He found the paragraph, read it, found it accurate to what she'd told him. He signed the paperwork and sent it back before noon. Marcus confirmed receipt 11 minutes later with a brief professional email that included his start date, the following Monday, and a building access card pickup time. The email was copied to Richard Park and to someone in HR named Donna Fleiss, and the whole transaction had the quality of something that had been prepared in advance, like the paperwork had been sitting ready for his answer rather than drafted after it. He lay down on the couch after that and slept for 4 hours without dreaming. When Lucas came home from school at 3:15, Ethan was awake and had made an actual meal for once, pasta, which was not impressive but was at least not crackers. And Lucas sat down at the table and said, "Did you tell me the truth this morning, or were you just tired and making things up? About the job?" "Yeah." "I told you the truth." Lucas considered this while winding pasta around his fork. "What kind of job is it?" "Reading contracts." "That sounds boring." "Parts of it are," Ethan said. "The interesting parts aren't boring. What makes a contract interesting? Ethan thought about page 22 of a 63-page document about the specific subordinate clause that had redirected a liability provision into a black hole of undisclosed debt. When someone's trying to hide something inside it, he said. Lucas looked up. Like what? Like money they owe, or rights to things they want to keep but are pretending to give away. That's stealing, Lucas said. It's a kind of stealing, yes. And you find it? I found it once, Ethan said. That's apparently enough to get a job doing it. Lucas went back to his pasta. After a moment, he said, without looking up, Mom would think that was cool. Ethan was quiet for a second. Yeah, he said. She would. Lucas didn't say anything else about it, which was the right move, and the two of them ate their pasta and talked about a project Lucas had due about the water cycle and whether cloud formations counted as part of the water cycle or a separate topic. And Ethan said they were the same topic, and Lucas said his teacher had implied otherwise, and Ethan said to write it down both ways and see which one the teacher preferred, which was not the most academically principled advice, but was the practical version. By the time Lucas was in bed, Ethan had started to feel the reality of Monday approaching the way you feel a weather system before it arrives. Not dread, exactly, just awareness, the anticipation of a thing that was going to require him to be a different version of himself than the version he'd been presenting to the world for the past several years. He sat on the couch after Lucas fell asleep and looked at the hole in the baseboard and thought, 1 more month of this, and then I can get that fixed properly. It was a small thought, but it was the first one in a long time that had moved in the direction of forward. Monday arrived the way Mondays always arrive, without any particular respect for the amount of mental preparation a person has attempted. Ethan dropped Lucas at school at 7:45, came home, put on the one suit he owned that still fit correctly, dark gray, bought for Mara's funeral and worn maybe 4 times since, which he tried not to think about, and got back on the subway at 8:15 heading downtown. The building looked different in the daytime. He'd been coming to it for 8 months, but always in the dark, always through the service entrance on the east side, always with the cleaning cart and the supply closet key on the ring, with all the other keys. Now he walked through the main lobby at 9:05 with his access card from HR and the lobby guard, a man named Carl, who Ethan had spoken to exactly once, at 3 in the morning, about whether the vending machine on 38 ever got restocked, looked at him with the particular confusion of someone whose mental filing system had just encountered an error. Mr. Brooks, Carl said, which was jarring because Carl had never called him Mr. anything. Carl, Ethan said. He took the elevator to 42. The floor looked different in the daytime, too. More people, more noise. The low collective sound of an office in operation. Keyboards and phones and the specific register of professional voices calibrated for a shared open space. He stood for a moment near the elevator bank getting his bearings, because the geography was the same, but the texture was completely different, and a part of his brain that had mapped this floor in the nighttime quiet had to revise its understanding. Marcus appeared at his elbow with the specific efficiency of someone who had been watching for him. Good morning. I'll take you to HR first to finish the paperwork, then I can show you to your workspace. Ms. Sterling would like 15 minutes with you at 10:30 if you're available. I'm available, Ethan said. HR was 2 floors down, a set of offices that Ethan had cleaned on Thursday nights, and that looked completely different, populated with actual human beings working in them. Donna Fleiss was a small woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who had processed a great many unusual employment situations without finding any of them particularly unusual. She walked him through the forms with calm efficiency, handed him his badge, explained the benefits enrollment portal, and then stopped and looked at him over her glasses. You're the one from the Kellner situation, she said. Word travels, Ethan said. In a building this size, word is basically infrastructure. She handed him a folder with the enrollment materials. The medical kicks in on day 1. Your son's existing providers, if they're in the network, which most of the major systems are, the coverage is comprehensive. If any of them aren't in network, come back and see me and we'll figure it out. He took the folder. Thank you. Don't thank me, I'm just doing my job. She paused. Though, for what it's worth, I've been here 11 years and I've never seen a hire process move that fast. She looked back at her screen. Monday. He wasn't sure if that was commentary or just observation, so he let it stand either way. His workspace was in the southwest corner of the 42nd floor, a desk near the window, which he suspected was not standard for a first-week position, but which he decided not to question. The international contracts team occupied a cluster of desks in that corner, 5 people currently present, 3 of whom looked up when Marcus brought him over, one of whom waved, and one of whom was on a phone call and barely registered his arrival, which was the kind of normal reaction that made him feel better about the whole thing. Richard Park appeared shortly after and shook his hand. "Good to have you officially," Richard said. He looked slightly less hollowed out than he had at 1 in the morning on the night of the Kellner situation, but still carried the look of someone for whom the memory of that night had not fully faded. "I want to start you on the backlog review. We have 6 active agreements in the German market portfolio that I'd like you to go through before we move to anything new. Take the first 2 days just reading. Don't try to do anything yet, just read and flag." "What am I flagging for?" "Anything that looks like what you found in the Kellner document." Richard said it plainly. "The short answer is, we don't know what we don't know." "That's why you're here." Ethan nodded. "Okay." "The longer answer is that after what Eleanor Voss and her team found on the Kellner document, our board is asking serious questions about whether our international review process has been adequate. So this is not a low-stakes assignment." "I understand." Richard looked at him for a moment. He had the quality of someone who was accustomed to reading people and was currently doing so. "You're not nervous," he said. Not quite a question. "I've had worse Tuesday nights," Ethan said. Richard Park made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. "Fair enough. I'll leave you to get settled." Ethan sat down, opened the first file, and started reading. Bucktown. The 10:30 with Olivia was in her office, not the boardroom, and it was shorter than he expected. She looked the same as she always looked, put together, alert, carrying the particular contained energy of someone running at a high operational tempo. She had the legal pad with his notes on it sitting on her desk, which he noticed but didn't comment on. "How was the morning?" she asked. "Fine. Richard gave me the backlog." "Good." She paused. "I want to be straightforward about something." "All right." "Your arrival here is going to be noticed," she said. "Not by everyone, and not in ways that will affect your work directly. But this is a company where people talk, and the Kellner situation is already circulating at a level I can't fully control. Some people are going to know who you are and why you're here before you've introduced yourself." "I know how offices work," he said. "I know you do." She looked at him steadily. "What I want you to know is that I'm not going to manage the narrative in a way that makes it a story about me, about how I found you or how this reflects on my leadership, or any version of that. What happened was what happened. You did the work. That's the story." He wasn't sure what had prompted her to say that. He also wasn't sure she was wrong to say it. "Is there pressure for a different narrative?" "There's always pressure," she said. "I'm telling you how I'm going to handle it." He nodded. "One more thing," she said. She hesitated, which was not something he'd seen her do before. "The people who laughed that night, 3 of them are on this floor. I can't undo that. What I can tell you is that if it creates a problem, I want to hear about it directly." "I'm not going to have a problem," he said. She looked like she wasn't entirely sure she believed that, but was willing to wait and see. "Okay." He went back to his desk. He opened the second file and kept reading. The first person to come to his desk was a woman named Grace Yoon, who was 3 years into the international contracts team and handled the Swiss and Austrian markets. She arrived at about 11:30 with 2 coffees, one of which she set on the corner of his desk without asking, and said, "I heard you speak German at a level that made Richard Park physically stand up." "He was already standing," Ethan said. He sat back down for most of it and then stood up again. "That counts." She leaned against the adjacent desk. "I'm Grace." "I know." "Marcus told you?" "Your nameplate." She looked at her desk. She did, in fact, have a nameplate. "Right." She picked up her own coffee. "I just wanted to say, I work the Austrian contracts, which are similar framework to Germany, but with some ABGB variations that make them specifically annoying. And if you're willing to be a resource on that side, I'm willing to be a resource on whatever you need navigating this place. It was a practical offer delivered practically. He liked that about it. Fair trade, he said. Good. She moved back toward her desk. Also, someone is going to ask you about the Kellner thing every day for approximately 2 weeks, and then it'll die down, just so you know. How many people so far today? Not counting me. Not counting you. 3, she said, but 2 of them were about the fraud specifically, not you personally, which is a different kind of question. He went back to his file. I'll keep that in mind. The trouble when it arrived didn't come from the direction he'd been expecting. He'd been at Sterling Global for 11 days when he received an email from someone named Douglas Hale, Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions. The email was copied to Richard Park and Thomas Wren, and its subject line was International Review Process, Proposed Adjustments. He read it once and then forwarded it to Richard with a single line. Is this what it looks like? Richard appeared at his desk 4 minutes later, which was faster than Ethan had expected. It's not a termination, Richard said immediately. I know. It's a restructuring proposal that would move the German market review function back to outside counsel and reclassify my position as a junior advisory role. Ethan looked at him. So, tell me what it actually is. Richard sat down in the empty chair beside the desk. He did it like a man preparing to have a conversation he'd rather not have. Douglas Hale ran this Kellner acquisition, Richard said. He was the one who sourced the deal, built the relationship with Kellner's principals, and championed it internally to the board. I know that. The acquisition failing, or rather the acquisition being exposed as fraudulent before it closed, has significant professional implications for him. Because the question isn't just whether Kellner tried to defraud Sterling Global. The question is whether Douglas Hale knew. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Did he? That's what Eleanor Voss is trying to determine, Richard said carefully. At this point, it's an open question. But the optics are not good for him, and you are currently the most visible symbol of the reason the deal didn't close. So the restructuring proposal is a way to reduce your visibility and your institutional standing before the board review gets far enough along to make certain questions unavoidable. Richard looked at him. That's my read. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He thought about the email's language, the careful, professional neutrality of it, the way it framed the restructuring as an efficiency measure, the way it cited best practices for outside legal oversight without ever mentioning his name directly. Does Olivia know about this? He asked. She will in approximately the next 15 minutes, Richard said. I'm going to her office now. I wanted to speak to you first because it seemed right. Ethan nodded. All right. Richard stood. Don't respond to the email. I wasn't going to. I know. I'm saying it anyway. He paused at the edge of the desk. You've been here 11 days and you've already read through 5 of the 6 backlog files and flagged 17 anomalies that our previous review process missed entirely. I want that on record somewhere, so I'm saying it to you now. Ethan looked at him. 17, Richard repeated, in 6 years of agreements. He went to Olivia's office. Ethan turned back to his screen, opened the 6th file, and kept reading. He found out what happened in the meeting secondhand through the specific communication channel of Grace Yoon appearing at his desk at 2 in the afternoon with the expression of someone carrying recent information. She took it apart, Grace said without preamble. What happened? Olivia read the proposal in front of Hale, Park, and Wren. And then she went through it clause by clause and identified every place where the logic didn't hold. The efficiency argument, the outside counsel argument, the best practices framing. She picked each one apart and asked him to defend it, and he couldn't. Grace paused. Then she told him that the international review function was staying as structured, that any proposed changes to personnel or scope would go through her directly, and that if he had concerns about the Kellner investigation, he should direct them to Eleanor Voss's team. Meaning she told him she knew what the proposal was really about, Ethan said. Without saying it directly, yes. Grace looked at him. You're not worried? I'm thinking, he said. Those look similar from the outside. He looked at Grace. Hale, what's his standing in the company? He's been here 8 years. He's close to 2 of the 4 board members. He runs a team of 12. She paused. He's not someone who takes things well when they don't go his way. I know the type, Ethan said. I figured. She stood up. Just wanted you to have the picture. He already had most of the picture. What he was thinking about now was the part of the picture that wasn't about him. The part about why Kellner had been willing to try a fraud of this scale, which required either enormous confidence or enormous desperation, and whether the person who had sourced the deal had known about the structure of what he was bringing to the table. He saved his notes on the 6th file and opened a new document. He started writing down what he remembered from the Kellner document, not from his translation notes, which were in Richard's possession, but from memory, which was good enough. He wasn't sure what he was looking for yet, but 17 anomalies and 6 years of agreements had told him something, and the something it had told him was that the problem was older than the Kellner deal. 3 days later, he found what he was looking for. It was in the 4th agreement from the backlog, a partnership contract with a Viennese investment management firm called Rausch Capital, signed 18 months ago, 2 years into Douglas Hale's tenure. The agreement was structured differently than the Kellner document, cleaner on the surface, simpler in its architecture, but there was a clause on page 19 that redirected a performance fee structure through a subsidiary entity that was not named elsewhere in the document. He spent 40 minutes cross-referencing it. Then he pulled the public registry filing for the subsidiary and found what he suspected he might find. He sat with it for a while before he did anything. Not because he wasn't sure, he was sure, but because doing something with it was going to change the shape of the next several weeks significantly, and he wanted to be clear in his own head about what he was doing and why. He was doing it because it was the work, because the work was finding the thing hidden in the language, and the thing was here, and not finding it was not an option. He printed the relevant pages, wrote his analysis in the margin the way he always did, clean, cross-referenced, annotated with the specific legal framework that made the clause significant, and walked to Richard Park's office. He knocked. Come in. He set the pages on Richard's desk. The Rausch Capital Agreement, page 19. Richard picked it up, read the clause, looked up. What am I looking at? The performance fee redirect? The subsidiary entity named in that clause. I pulled the public registry. The entity was incorporated 4 months before the Rausch agreement was signed. He paused. The listed beneficial owner is a trust registered in Delaware. Which tells us nothing directly, Richard said. No, but the trust was incorporated by the same law firm that structured the Kellner acquisition. He set a second page on top of the first. Same firm, 2 different deals, both involving anomalous financial structures embedded in German-language legal provisions. Richard looked at the pages for a long moment. Ethan, he said. I know. This isn't about Kellner anymore. No, Ethan said. It isn't. Richard put the pages down. He looked at the window for a moment with the expression of a man updating his internal risk calculations in real time. Then he picked up his phone. I need to call Eleanor Voss, he said. I figured. And I need to call Olivia. I know. This is going to get complicated, Richard said. It wasn't a warning so much as a statement of fact delivered to both of them equally. It was already complicated, Ethan said. I'm just reading the language that was already there. Richard dialed. Ethan walked back to his desk. Grace looked up from her screen as he passed. She read something in his face, or his posture, or the quality of his walk, and said quietly, How bad? He sat down, opened his screen. Complicated, he said. How complicated? He thought about the right way to describe the specific kind of complicated that happens when a pattern appears in documents that were supposed to be reviewed and weren't, when the pattern points toward a person who is still in the building and still has standing and still has access, when you are 11 days into a new job and you have just handed the person who hired you a problem that is larger than the one that got you hired. The kind that takes a while, he said. Grace turned back to her screen. She didn't ask anything else, which he appreciated. He pulled up the 5th backlog file, the one he hadn't opened yet, and started reading. He found the first anomaly on page 11. He wrote it down, cross-referenced it, moved to the next page. Outside the 42nd floor windows, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan always did. Going and going, indifferent to the specific human complications inside any given building, enormous and lit and completely unaware of the quiet man at the corner desk, reading contracts with a pen in his hand and finding, in the dense legal language that most people never slowed down enough to understand, the things that someone had very much hoped would never be found. Eleanor Voss arrived at Sterling Global at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning with 2 associates and a document request list that ran to 4 pages. Ethan knew she was coming because Richard had told him the night before, and he knew what it meant because Richard had been careful to explain it without overstating it. The document request wasn't a subpoena. It wasn't a formal legal action. It was an investigative step, the kind of step that precedes formal legal action when outside counsel is building a picture carefully enough to make sure it holds. "They're going to want to speak with you," Richard had said. "I know. Probably more than once." "I know that too." He had come in early, 7:40, earlier than almost anyone on the floor except Marcus and one of the analysts on the east side who always seemed to be there before sunrise. He'd made himself coffee in the small kitchen near the elevator bank and sat at his desk and gone through his notes on the Rausch Capital agreement one more time. Not because he'd missed anything. He hadn't missed anything. He did it because sitting with a document and knowing it completely was the only kind of preparation that made sense to him. Eleanor Voss stopped at his desk at 8:15. She was the same as he remembered from that first morning. Careful, measured, the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades understanding that the most important information in a room is usually the information no one is volunteering. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I'd like some time with you this morning if Richard can spare you." "He told me," Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment. "You pulled the Rausch Capital subsidiary registration yourself?" "Yes." "Before Richard came to you with it, or after?" "I found it and went to Richard," he said. "He didn't ask me to look." She nodded slowly. "Can you walk me through your methodology? How you approached the backlog review, what you were looking for, how you identified the connection between Rausch and Kellner?" "Yes," he said. "But I want to ask you something first." She raised an eyebrow very slightly. "How far back does this go?" he said. She held his gaze for a moment. The kind of pause that isn't uncertainty. It's evaluation. "That's what we're trying to determine," she said. "I have the 5th backlog file open," he said. "I found anomalies in it yesterday afternoon that I haven't reported yet because I wanted to finish the full document before I said anything. Can I have 2 hours before we sit down?" She looked at him for a second, then, 2 hours. He turned back to his screen. The meeting with Eleanor's team ran for most of the morning in the smaller conference room, the one Ethan had been cleaning on the night of the Kellner situation, back when this was still someone else's problem. Now he sat at the table with 2 yellow legal pads and a printed copy of his notes, and walked them through everything he'd found, in order, from the Kellner document through the Rausch Capital agreement, through the 5th backlog file, which turned out to be a distribution partnership with a Hamburg logistics company that had the same subsidiary redirection structure as Rausch, different entity, same Delaware incorporation firm, same pattern. One of Eleanor's associates was a young woman named Claire, who typed everything and occasionally asked clarifying questions that were more precise than they appeared on the surface. The other was a man named Barrow, who said almost nothing but wrote constantly in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil. "The pattern you're describing," Eleanor said, about 90 minutes in. 3 agreements, all German market, all involving subsidiary entities with connections to the same incorporation firm. Your assessment is that this is not coincidence. My assessment is that the same legal architecture was used in all 3 cases, Ethan said. Whether that architecture was coordinated or separately arrived at, I can't determine from the documents alone. But the structural similarity is specific enough that it would require independent parties to make exactly the same series of unusual drafting choices in exactly the same sequence. And your estimate of the financial impact across the 3 agreements? Rausch and Hamburg together, based on the redirected fee structures, I'd estimate somewhere between 60 and 90 million over the life of the contracts. Kellner is in a different category. The undisclosed liability exposure was potentially 8 to 10 times that. Claire stopped typing for a moment, then started again. The question I can't answer from the documents, Ethan said, is whether Sterling Global was the only target or whether this law firm structure was used in deals with other companies. Eleanor looked at him. That's the right question, she said quietly. It had the quality of a statement she hadn't intended to make out loud, and she moved past it quickly. We'll need your notes. Everything. The annotations, the cross-references, the subsidiary findings. I have copies for you. He slid 2 folders across the table. She picked them up, looked at the top page of the first folder, and was quiet for a moment. Mr. Brooks, she said, you've been at Sterling Global for how long? 17 days. She looked up. 17 days? Yes? She looked at the folder again. The previous review process, outside counsel, prior to your hire, had been in place for 6 years. I know. She closed the folder. She didn't say anything else about it, but she didn't need to. The floor had a different quality to it for the rest of that day. Not loud. Nothing visible had changed. No announcements, no visible disruption. But the specific texture of people going about their work with a portion of their attention directed elsewhere was there if you knew what to look for, and Ethan knew what to look for. He had been back at his desk for about an hour when Douglas Hale walked past. Hale was not a small man. He had the physical bearing of someone who had spent his career being the most senior person in most rooms. Not aggressive exactly, but occupying space in a way that communicated an expectation of deference. Ethan had seen him twice since starting, once in the hallway near Richard's office, once in the elevator. Both times Hale had looked at him and then looked away, the specific kind of not looking that is a form of looking. This time Hale stopped. Ethan kept his eyes on his screen. Brooks, Hale said. Ethan looked up. Hale was standing beside the desk with his hands in his pockets. His expression was the specific neutrality of someone who had spent years in corporate environments learning to deliver threatening messages in language that couldn't be quoted later. I heard you had a long morning, Hale said. Meetings, Ethan said, with outside counsel. Yes. Hale looked at the desk, at the open files, the yellow legal pads, the folders. He was doing the assessment that powerful people do when they're trying to understand the scope of something. You've been busy, he said. That's the job, Ethan said. Hale looked at him. You know, in my experience, people who come into a new environment and immediately start looking for problems, they're not always finding real problems. Sometimes they're finding the things that look like problems to someone who doesn't have the full context. Ethan looked at him steadily. What context am I missing? Hale smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach any other part of the face. Complex deals have complex structures. Not everything that looks unusual is unusual for the wrong reasons. I appreciate the perspective, Ethan said. I'll keep it in mind. The smile stayed exactly where it was. You do that, Hale said. He walked away. Grace appeared at the edge of Ethan's desk approximately 30 seconds after Hale turned the corner. That was fun to watch, she said. You were watching? Everyone was watching, she said. We were just looking at our screens while we did it. She glanced in the direction Hale had gone. He went to your desk. That's not normal. I know. What did he say? Ethan turned back to his screen. He suggested I might be lacking context. What did you say? I thanked him for the perspective. Grace was quiet for a moment. Are you actually worried? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. I'm annoyed. Those are different. What's annoying you? The assumption that I don't understand what I'm reading. He paused. I understand exactly what I'm reading. Grace went back to her desk without saying anything else. That was the right response, and she gave it. He told Olivia about the Hale conversation that afternoon, not because he thought it warranted escalation, but because he'd decided early in this job that the things he observed should go somewhere on the record, even the things that felt ambient rather than specific. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, He came to your desk. Yes. That was a mistake on his part. She said it matter-of-factly, not with satisfaction. I'm not interested in escalating it, Ethan said. I just wanted you to know. I know? She picked up a pen and put it down again. How are you? Genuinely, how are you doing with all of this? You've been here 17 days and you've handed us an investigation that's significantly larger than the one we started with. He considered the question. It wasn't the kind of question he was used to being asked at work, and he wasn't entirely sure how to answer it honestly without making it into more than it was. I'm fine, he said. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes got, the one that suggested she knew the answer she'd received was technically accurate and not entirely complete. Okay, she said. What about Lucas? He's good. He had a pulmonology appointment last week. The new coverage, the specialist didn't blink. Everything went through without the back and forth I'm used to. Something moved across her face. It was brief, and she moved past it quickly. Good. The nebulizer is also fixed, he said, which he hadn't planned to say but which came out anyway. She looked at him. You fixed it yourself? The connector tube. It's a standard part. I ordered it online. He paused. The landlord also fixed the baseboard, finally, so the week had a lot going for it. She was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that happens when someone has realized they're seeing a fuller picture of a person's life than they'd had before, and is deciding what to do with the added dimension. I'm glad, she said simply. He nodded and stood up. I'll have the notes on the Hamburg file ready for Eleanor's team tomorrow morning. Ethan, she said. He stopped. You know that what you found, the pattern across those 3 agreements, it puts us in a position where the board is going to have questions about oversight, internal oversight, how something like this ran for 2 years without being caught. I know. That conversation is going to happen in the next week or 2. I want you to know that your position is not in any way contingent on how that conversation goes. I know that too, he said. I'm saying it directly so there's no ambiguity. I understand. He looked at her for a second. For what it's worth, I'm not worried about my position. I'm worried about the Hamburg Agreement's third-party compliance clauses, because there are 2 sub-provisions in Section 11 that I think create compounding exposure beyond what I estimated this morning. She blinked. Then she almost smiled. Not quite, but something close to it. Put it in the notes. It's already there, he said. He went back to his desk. But the board meeting was called for the following Tuesday. Ethan knew about it because the 42nd floor, which had been operating with the specific careful energy of a place where something large was in motion beneath the visible surface, shifted noticeably on Monday afternoon when the calendar invitations went out and 5 executives simultaneously stopped walking past each other in the hallway and started walking around each other instead. He was not invited to the board meeting. That was correct and expected. His role was the documents, and the documents had already done what they were going to do. On Monday evening, he stayed at his desk until 7:30, longer than usual, but he'd told Lucas he'd be late and Mrs. Cisneros had the key. He was finishing the annotation on the Hamburg sub-provisions when Olivia came out of her office at 7 and stopped when she saw him still there. Go home, she said. 5 minutes. You said that 40 minutes ago. Marcus told me. Marcus is watching my desk? Marcus watches everything. It's why I keep him. She came to stand near his desk. The floor was mostly empty. The cleaning crew, the night shift, had started on the south corridor. He could hear the distant sound of the floor buffer. He had a moment of the specific, slightly uncomfortable sensation of being in 2 places in his mind at once. You're going to be called in tomorrow, she said. Not to the board meeting, after it. Eleanor will want you there when she presents the pattern analysis. Richard told me. How do you feel about that? I feel like I should review the Hamburg section 11 notes one more time tonight. She looked at him with the expression that was becoming familiar, the one that suggested he was doing the thing where he answered a question about his feelings with a sentence about work, and she'd noticed the pattern, and she'd decided not to push it because she probably did the same thing herself. Go home, Ethan, she said. He saved the file. I was going to. You were going to do it in 5 minutes. Same thing. She shook her head slightly. the kind of head shake that is the physical form of an exasperation that has mild affection somewhere underneath it, and went back toward her office. She stopped at the door. "Tell Lucas I said his father works too hard." He looked up. "You've never met Lucas." "I know. Tell him anyway." He closed his laptop. The board meeting ran for 4 hours on Tuesday. Ethan was at his desk for most of it, which was the right place for him to be. He worked on a separate review request Richard had given him, a new Austrian market agreement that had come in the previous week, unrelated to the investigation, requiring straightforward German language analysis, and let the morning pass the way mornings passed when large things were happening somewhere else in the building. At 12:40, Richard appeared at his desk looking like a man who had just come through a long tunnel. "How was it?" Ethan asked. "Long." Richard sat down in the adjacent chair and didn't say anything for a moment. Eleanor presented the full pattern analysis, 3 agreements, connected architecture, estimated aggregate exposure, questions of internal oversight. He paused. "The board has authorized a full internal audit of the international acquisitions process going back to the beginning of Hale's tenure." Ethan nodded. "All of it?" "All 6 years." Richard looked at the window. "Hale is on administrative leave effective today, pending the outcome." The floor was quiet around them. Most people were at lunch. "How did Olivia handle it?" Ethan asked. "Well," Richard said it without elaboration, which probably meant it had been difficult and she had handled it well anyway, which was a different thing than it being easy. She was prepared. Eleanor's team gave her a thorough briefing last night. He paused. The board had questions about how the pattern went undetected for 2 years under the previous review process. What did she say? She said the previous process had structural gaps that created review blind spots in German language provisions, and that those gaps have been identified and addressed. He looked at Ethan. She said it in a way that made it clear she was describing a systemic failure, not a personnel failure, and that the appropriate response was the audit, not individual blame. "That's the right framing," Ethan said. "Yes." Richard was quiet for a moment. She also told the board that the reason the Kellner fraud was caught before it closed was because a member of her team had the specific expertise to identify what the previous process would have missed. He paused. "She said it without your name, but everyone in the room knew who she was talking about." Ethan turned this over. "She didn't have to say that." "No," Richard said. "She didn't." They sat with that for a moment. "The audit team is going to need you heavily over the next few weeks," Richard said. "Probably 6 to 8 weeks of intensive review, depending on what they find. It's going to be demanding." "I understand." "You'll need to coordinate with Eleanor's team directly on the German language documents and with the audit firm on the financial structure analysis. It's going to mean long hours." "I know." Richard looked at him. "You're not going to say it's a lot." "It is a lot," Ethan said. "I just don't see the point of saying so." Richard made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He stood up. "I'll send you the audit coordination details this afternoon." He left. Ethan opened the Austrian agreement and kept reading. The intensive period that followed was the most demanding stretch of work Ethan had done since graduate school, and in some ways more demanding than that, because the stakes in graduate school had been academic, and the stakes here were financial and legal and involved real consequences for real people, which focused the mind in a way that seminar papers never quite did. He worked long hours, but structured ones. He arranged with Richard to be in the office by 7:30 most mornings, so he could leave by 5 on the days Lucas had afternoon appointments, and make up the time in the evenings after Lucas was asleep. It wasn't elegant. Some nights he was at the kitchen table with his laptop at 10:30, cross-referencing provision language by the light of the overhead kitchen fixture while Lucas slept down the hall. But it was manageable in a way that his previous years had not been manageable, because manageable required money and flexibility, and both of those things now existed in a form they hadn't before. The audit turned up 2 additional agreements with structural anomalies, a partnership with a Munich media company, and a licensing deal with an Austrian tech firm. Neither was as severe as Kellner, but both had the same DNA, subsidiary redirection, embedded liability exposure, and language crafted to evade standard English language review. 6 agreements, 6 years, a pattern that was either extraordinary bad luck or wasn't luck at all. Eleanor Voss, when Ethan sat down with her for the 7th time to review his findings, said something that she'd been careful not to say in the earlier meetings. The Delaware incorporation firm has been identified. Their client list is under subpoena. Has Sterling Global been the only target? Ethan asked. No, she said. You were right to ask the question. He sat with that. How many companies? He said. We know of 4 others so far. Possibly more. She looked at him across the conference table. You identified the pattern from the inside of one company's documents. The full scale of this. It's significantly larger. He thought about that for a moment. About the 63 pages of a document he'd read at midnight because he'd heard something in a voice on the other side of a door and decided, for whatever reason, not to keep walking. Is there anything else you need from the Sterling Global side? He asked. Not immediately. She paused. I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as a professional observation rather than a compliment. Okay? The quality of your analysis, the annotation methodology, the cross-referencing, the way you identified pattern from what looked like isolated anomalies, it's the work of someone at the top of a very specialized field. She said it without performance, just the statement. The academic community's loss was apparent. He looked at the table. I made the choice I made, he said. I don't have regrets about it. I know, she said. I'm not suggesting you should. A pause. I'm suggesting that the field hasn't lost the expertise, it just moved somewhere it wasn't expected. He drove home that evening in a rental car. He'd been renting one on the weeks when Lucas had late afternoon appointments, which was new because renting a car had been out of the question before and now was not. And he thought about what Eleanor had said, the way you think about something that lands true, but lands in a place you haven't fully examined. Lucas was at the kitchen table when he got home, working on a school project about rivers and erosion, which involved a printed map of the United States with several rivers highlighted in yellow. The Mississippi goes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, Lucas said, without looking up. That's correct, Ethan said. That's really far. It is. Lucas looked up. You look tired, but not bad tired. Ethan took off his jacket and hung it on the chair. What's the difference? Bad tired is when you look like you're thinking about something heavy. You just look regular tired. He went back to the map. Did something good happen? Ethan sat down across from him. He thought about the right answer. Someone told me they thought my work was good, he said. Specifically, good. Not just good. Oh, Lucas said. Like when Mr. Garner told me my water cycle report was the best one in the class. Something like that, yeah. Lucas nodded seriously. That feels different than just passing, he said. It does, Ethan agreed. They sat at the kitchen table together, Lucas with his map and his yellow highlighter, Ethan with a cup of coffee and the particular tired that comes at the end of a long day of doing work that actually matters. And outside the window, the neighborhood ran through its evening routines. And the apartment was warm, and the nebulizer on the counter was quiet because it was working correctly, and the hole in the baseboard was filled and painted over. And none of these things were large, but all of them were real. And real was what Ethan Brooks had been working toward for longer than he could easily say. He picked up Lucas's map and looked at the Mississippi River. It does go all the way to the Gulf, he said. I know, Lucas said. I just said that. I'm agreeing with you. You don't have to agree with me, Lucas said. It's a fact. Facts don't need agreement. Ethan looked at his son, 8 years old, eating crackers and teaching him epistemology. Fair point, he said. Lucas capped his highlighter. Dad, he said. Yeah. Are things going to keep being okay now? Like, is this the part where they stay okay? Ethan thought about the audit running for 2 more weeks, about the board questions still outstanding, about Douglas Hale on administrative leave and the Delaware firm's client list under subpoena and the 6 agreements and the 4 other companies and all the moving parts of a thing that had started with a knock on a boardroom door. Yeah, he said, I think this is the part where they stay okay. Lucas considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. Good, he said, and opened his map again. Ethan finished his coffee. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, the old radiator made its usual sound. A knock, and then a hiss, like it was reminding them it was still there, still working, doing the job it had always done. The audit concluded on a Friday afternoon in late October, 6 weeks after it had started, and the building felt it end the way buildings feel the end of long, contained things. Not with noise or visible release, but with a kind of barometric shift, a subtle change in pressure that everyone on the 42nd floor registered without anyone saying so directly. Ethan was at his desk when Eleanor Voss and her team carried the last of their materials to the elevator. She stopped at his desk on her way out, just for a moment, the way she always stopped, brief and deliberate. "We're done here," she said. "I know." "The formal report goes to the board on Monday. After that, it becomes a legal matter and moves out of our hands." He nodded. He already knew the broad shape of what the report would say, because he had contributed to the annexes that documented the pattern analysis and the document evidence, and because 6 weeks of working alongside Eleanor's team had given him a reasonably clear picture of where the investigation had landed. Douglas Hale had not come back to the 42nd floor after his administrative leave began. His office had been cleared out in the second week, quietly, over a weekend, in the way that these things are done when the company would prefer the removal not become a hallway conversation. Ethan had noticed the empty glass-walled office on a Monday morning and had not said anything about it to anyone because there was nothing useful to say. The Delaware Incorporation firm had cooperated with the subpoena, which Eleanor's associate Claire had mentioned in passing during their last working session, with the particular neutral tone of someone delivering information they find significant but professionally cannot editorialize about. The cooperation had apparently resolved several questions about the structure of the scheme quickly, which either meant the principals at the firm were hoping for leniency or meant the documentation was damning enough that denial was not a viable strategy. Probably both. "You should know," Eleanor said, standing at his desk with her briefcase in hand, "that your analysis will be cited in the legal filings. Your name will be on the document record." "I know. That means it becomes public at some point, when the filings are processed." "I understand." She looked at him for a moment. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "The work is the work. It should have a name on it." She nodded once, the kind of nod that means several things at once and trusts the other person to sort through them. Then she picked up her briefcase and walked to the elevator. Ethan turned back to his screen. He had a new Austrian agreement to review. Straightforward, clean, nothing unusual in the first 30 pages. He kept reading. The board's formal response came the following Wednesday, in the form of an all-hands communication from Olivia that was careful in its language and clear in its meaning. It acknowledged the internal audit, described the structural changes being made to the international review process, and announced that the company was cooperating fully with the legal proceedings that had been initiated. It did not mention Douglas Hale by name. It did not need to. What it also said, in the second-to-last paragraph, in language that was direct without being performative, was that the fraud had been identified before any harm was done to the company because of the expertise of a member of the international contracts team who had identified the pattern across multiple agreements and brought it forward immediately. It named Ethan Brooks. Grace appeared at his desk approximately 4 minutes after the email went out. "You knew it was in there?" she said. "No." "You look like you knew." "I look like someone who is trying to figure out how to finish this agreement by end of day," he said. "You don't have to be modest about it," Grace said. "It's a company-wide email." "I know what it is," he said. "I'm not being modest. I'm being focused." She went back to her desk. He could hear her a moment later saying something quiet to the analyst 2 desks over, something he didn't catch, but the tone of it was the tone of someone making a point they'd been wanting to make for a while. He finished the Austrian agreement by 4:30 and sent it to Richard with his notes. Richard replied in 7 minutes. "Clean?" Ethan replied, "Clean." A pause. Then, "First clean one in 6 weeks. I'll take it." Ethan closed his laptop and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a late Wednesday afternoon in an office where the visible crisis had passed, and the invisible one was in someone else's hands now, being handled through legal processes that moved slowly and did not require his daily attention. He thought about the word clean. What it meant to find a document without a trap in it, without a subordinate clause that redirected something essential, without a carefully hidden provision designed to be missed. He thought about how the clean documents had always been there alongside the poisoned ones, how they were the majority and always had been, How the job was not to assume everything was wrong, but to know the difference between the things that were fine and the things that weren't. That, he thought, was the job. Not suspicion, precision. He picked up his jacket and went home. Chuck. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, Olivia asked him to stay after the rest of the floor had cleared out. Not through Marcus. She came to his desk herself, which she'd done a handful of times now, and which still had the quality of something slightly unusual. A CEO navigating her own open floor plan to speak to someone directly rather than routing everything through channels. "Have you got 15 minutes?" she said. Yes. They ended up in her office, which had become, over the past 2 months, a more familiar space to him than he would have predicted when he first came to this floor in the daylight. He sat in the chair across from her desk. She'd started pulling that chair out slightly before he came in, a small adjustment he'd noticed after the third or fourth time. And she was at her desk, but not in the behind-the-desk posture, more sideways, like she was thinking about something adjacent to what they were about to discuss. "The board met yesterday," she said. "The formal legal referral has been filed. From our side, the matter is essentially out of our hands now. The restructuring of the review process is complete. The audit findings have been submitted." "I know," he said. "Richard updated me." "I know he did." She paused. "I wanted to have a separate conversation with you, not a work conversation." He waited. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that comes out as what it actually is, and not as what it might sound like." She stopped. "I'm not great at this." "Say the version you have," he said. "You can clarify after." She looked at him for a second, then nodded. "When I pointed at you that night in the boardroom, when I let that moment go the way I let it go, I was treating you as a category rather than a person, not because I'm cruel, because I was scared and exhausted and I'd stopped looking at individuals and started managing resources." She paused. "That's the honest version." I know that," he said. "I know you know it. I want to say it clearly anyway, separate from the professional conversation." She looked at him directly. "And I want to say that watching you work over the past 2 months, I've learned more about what I was missing in this company's review process than I would have learned in another 5 years of normal operations. Not just the technical gaps, the human ones." He wasn't entirely sure what she meant by the human ones. "Meaning what?" "Meaning that the way you work, the methodology, the carefulness, the way you follow what's actually in the document rather than what you want to be in the document, it's exposed a habit we had, collectively, of seeing what we expected to see." She looked at the window. "Hale brought us deals. The deals came with a certain confidence attached, a certain pre-approval, and people stopped reading them as carefully as they should have because reading them carefully would have been, on some level, a challenge to his authority." She paused. "That's not an excuse. That's a failure I own." Ethan thought about that, about the specific dynamic she was describing. The way authority and confidence can function as a form of document pre-formatting, telling the reader what they're supposed to find before they've read the first page. "That's not unique to this company," he said. "No, but it happened here and the cost could have been enormous." She turned back to face him. "I don't want it to happen again. Part of that is the structural changes we've made. Part of it is something harder to structure, the willingness to slow down and read what's actually there." "You can't mandate that," he said. "No," she agreed, "but you can build a culture around it. And that's slower and messier, and I'm not sure I know how to do it yet." She paused. "I'm figuring it out." The room was quiet for a moment. "You should know," he said, "that the Rausch and Hamburg exposures are recoverable. Based on the current agreement terms and the renegotiation leverage created by the fraud findings, the legal team has options that put Sterling Global in a reasonable position." She almost smiled. "Almost." "I know. Richard told me. Then he told me you'd bring it up at some point because you'd been thinking about the recovery structure. It's the logical next question after the audit." "Yes." She did smile then. Not the performance smile, not the professional smile, but the kind that happens when something lands exactly as expected, and the expectation itself is the source of some warmth. "I know." He stood up. I'll put together a summary analysis of the renegotiation leverage points if that would be useful. Tomorrow, she said. Go home, Ethan. It won't take long. Tomorrow, she said again, with the firm kindness of someone who had decided this was the hill. Lucas is waiting. He paused. He's at a friend's house until 8. Then go pick up your son from his friend's house and have dinner and be a person outside this building for a few hours. She said it without drama. Just the observation, offered plainly. He looked at her for a moment. She was right, and he knew she was right, and the rightness of it was the specific kind that was slightly uncomfortable because it required him to admit that someone else had noticed something about his own habits that he'd been half aware of but hadn't acted on. All right, he said. He picked up his jacket. Ethan, she said. He turned. Thank you for all of it. Not just the Kellner night, all of it. He nodded. He could have said something, but the moment didn't particularly need more words in it. He went to the elevator, took it down to the lobby, and walked out into the October evening. He picked up Lucas at 7:45 from a kid named Oliver's apartment 12 blocks from their own. Lucas came out with the specific energized quality of a child who has spent 3 hours playing video games and eating snacks and is now running on a combination of sugar and competitive pride. We beat the 3rd level, Lucas announced, pulling on his jacket in the hallway. Of what? The game. The one where you build the bridge. Oliver kept doing it wrong, and I figured out the load distribution, and we got it. Ethan looked at his son. Load distribution. You have to balance the weight on both sides, or the bridge falls in the water. Lucas said it with the casualness of someone explaining the obvious. It's not that complicated once you see it. No, Ethan said. It's not. They walked home through the October dark. Lucas in his jacket with his hands in his pockets, doing the half-step shuffle he did when he was in a good mood. And the sidewalk was relatively empty, and he didn't have to navigate around people. The city was doing the thing it did on Thursday evenings, the specific midweek quality of people who have made it to almost Friday and are slightly looser than they were on Monday. The restaurants full and the sidewalks occupied and the overhead lights giving everything that amber cast that New York does in autumn. Dad, Lucas said. Yeah. Oliver's dad asked me what your job was, and I said you find things that are hidden in documents that people are trying to trick companies with. That's a reasonable description, Ethan said. He said that sounded really important. It has its moments. Lucas was quiet for half a block. Do you like it? Like, actually like it? Ethan thought about that honestly. He thought about the 6th backlog file and the subordinate clause in Rausch Capital, and the Hamburg Section 11, and the 7 sessions with Eleanor Voss, and the Austrian agreement that had come back clean. He thought about sitting in a graduate seminar at 23 years old with a printed copy of a GmbH acquisition framework, and feeling for the first time that he was somewhere his brain was actually calibrated to be. Yeah, he said. I actually like it. Good, Lucas said. You should like your job. Mom always said that. Ethan looked at his son walking beside him in the amber-lit October dark. She did say that, he said. She said life is too short to do a job that makes you feel like nothing. Lucas paused. I don't think she meant cleaning was bad. I think she meant doing something that makes you feel invisible. 8 years old. He said it like he was reporting a fact, which was, Ethan thought, exactly how Mara would have wanted it delivered. Not as a wound, just as a truth that deserved to be said out loud. Yeah, Ethan said. That's what she meant. They walked the rest of the way home without talking, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who have been through the same things and don't need to narrate them. In the weeks that followed, the building at Sterling Global settled into a different rhythm. The legal proceedings involving Douglas Hale and the Delaware firm moved into a phase that no longer required Ethan's daily attention, handled now by Eleanor Voss and the litigation team, and whatever machinery the legal system runs on when it gets hold of something it intends to process. Ethan received a request from Eleanor's team in November for a follow-up clarification on the Rausch subsidiary analysis, which he provided in writing in about 40 minutes, and that was the last time the investigation touched his daily work directly. The international contracts team grew by 2 people, a junior analyst and a specialist in French and Dutch market agreements, which expanded the team's capacity into markets Sterling Global had been handling through outside review. Richard Park restructured the review workflow to route all foreign language acquisition documents through the in-house team as first pass, with outside counsel reserved for litigation support and complex jurisdictional questions. It was a sensible change. It was also, Ethan was aware, the kind of change that doesn't happen without something going badly wrong first, which was the specific irony of institutional improvement. It usually required a disaster to justify itself. He worked with the new junior analyst, a recent law school graduate named Priya, who had studied in Berlin for 2 years and had the particular combination of raw intelligence and excessive confidence that belongs to people who are going to be either very good or very difficult, depending on what happens to them in the first few years. He gave her the same first assignment Richard had given him, backlog review, just read, just flag. And she came back to him on the third day with 17 flags, 12 of which were legitimate anomalies and 5 of which were standard provisions she'd misread because of a gap in her understanding of GmbH cross-referencing conventions. He spent 45 minutes with her on the 5 false flags. "How do you tell the difference so fast?" she asked. "Pattern recognition," he said, which sounds like a non-answer but isn't. You build it over time by reading clean documents alongside the anomalous ones. The anomaly only registers clearly when you know what clean looks like. She looked at her notes. "How long does that take?" "Depends on how much you read." That's also a non-answer. "It's a true one," he said. "Start the next file." She started the next file. She was going to be good, he thought. The excessive confidence would either moderate itself or cause her real problems. And that was going to be her thing to work out, not his. But the raw capability was there, and that was the part he could actually do something with. December arrived, and with it the specific quality of a Manhattan year-end. The decorations and the cold and the shortened days, and the particular mood of an organization reviewing itself against the 12 months just concluded. Sterling Global had a holiday gathering on the second Friday of December, held in the main event space 2 floors below 42, and it was the first company social event Ethan attended. He went because Grace had told him it would be weird if he didn't, which was probably true, and because Lucas had been insisting for 2 weeks that he needed to do more things with people, which was the kind of unsolicited social advice that a person does not expect to receive from an 8-year-old, but which was also, he had to admit, not wrong. The gathering was what company gatherings always are. Slightly awkward at the start, progressively less awkward as people had a drink and remembered that they actually knew each other, and punctuated by the specific social geography of a large organization trying to exist as a community for 2 hours before returning to being a hierarchy on Monday. He stood near the window for the first part of it, talking with Grace and with Thomas Wren, who turned out to be, outside of the context of financial crisis, a relatively relaxed person with strong opinions about the subway's 2nd Avenue extension and a collection of jazz records he was willing to discuss at some length. Olivia moved through the room with the quality she always had in group settings, aware of everything, managing multiple conversations simultaneously, giving each person the impression of full attention without losing track of the larger room. He watched her do it with something close to professional admiration because it was genuinely skilled, and he had enough respect for skilled things to acknowledge them regardless of context. She reached him about 40 minutes in, when the room had reached a comfortable volume. "You came," she said. Grace was persuasive. Grace is always persuasive. She was holding a glass of wine and had the look of someone who had spoken to every person in the room at least once. "How's Lucas?" "He's at a holiday concert at his school tonight. He has a speaking part." "What does he say?" "I don't know. He won't tell me. He says I have to wait for the performance." She laughed. A real one, not the professional version. It was the kind of laugh that came out before the person could decide whether to have it or not. "That's excellent," she said. "He's been practicing in his room with the door closed for a week," Ethan said. "I can hear him through the door, but I can't make out the words." "You're going to be a mess at the concert." "I'm not going to be a mess at the concert." She looked at him with the expression that had become familiar over the past 3 months, the one that meant she knew he was probably wrong about whatever he'd just said, but was willing to let the night prove it. "What time does it start?" 7:30? He glanced at the time on his phone. "I should leave by 6:45. Then go at 6:45. She said it without making it a thing, just practical, the way she was practical when she wasn't trying to be anything else. I will, he said. I'm just saying. I know. She looked around the room for a moment, then back at him. Ethan, before the year is out and this all becomes something we just move forward from, I want to say one thing. He waited. I spent the first year and a half running this company trying to prove that I was capable of doing what my father did, she said. Which is a terrible way to run a company, but it's the way I was running it. And the Kellner situation, or rather, the way it almost became a disaster and then didn't, it changed something in how I think about what capable actually means. She paused. Because capable, the way I'd been defining it, was about performance, about not being caught making a mistake, about looking in control. And now? Now I think it's more about building things that can catch mistakes before they become catastrophes, which requires admitting the mistakes are possible, which is harder than it sounds. She looked at him. You showed up not knowing anything about this company, and you read what was actually in the documents instead of what the confidence around them implied. That's not a skill. It's a disposition. And I've spent 3 months trying to figure out how to build that disposition into this organization's culture instead of just relying on one person who happens to have it. He thought about this. You can't import a disposition, he said. You can only create conditions where it survives. I know. I'm trying to create the conditions. He nodded. You're doing better at it than you think. She looked at him sharply. Not offended, more surprised that he'd offered something that direct. What makes you say that? Priya flags 12 legitimate anomalies in 3 days, and you don't hear about it as a success story from Richard. She just does the work, and it goes into the review file, and the process continues. That's a condition. He paused. 6 months ago, that would have been a headline. Now it's just Tuesday. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Tuesday. Yeah. She looked at her glass. I'm going to think about that. You'll be fine, he said. She gave him the look again. The one that had mild exasperation and something else underneath it, something that had developed over 3 months of working alongside each other in the specific, unglamorous way that two people develop a professional trust, which is not sudden and not romantic and not uncomplicated, but is real in the way that things earned slowly are real. Go to your son's concert, she said. He went. Lucas's speaking part turned out to be 3 lines from a poem about winter that the class had chosen together, and he delivered them with the specific combination of total confidence and total earnestness that belongs to 8-year-olds who haven't yet learned to be embarrassed about caring about things. Ethan sat in the folding chair in the school gymnasium and watched his son stand at the front of the room under the gymnasium lights and say his 3 lines in a clear, steady voice, and he did not, as Olivia had predicted, become a mess. He did, however, feel something move through him in the way things move through a person when they've been braced against something for long enough that they've forgotten what not braced feels like, and the bracing very slowly releases. It wasn't joy, exactly. Or it was joy, but complicated. The kind you feel when you've been in a long, dark period, and the light has been returning in increments too small to notice day by day. And then something small but perfect happens in a school gymnasium, and you realize that the light has come back, that it's been coming back, that you are no longer where you were. After the concert, walking home, Lucas slipped his hand into Ethan's without preamble or comment, the way he'd done when he was younger, the way he'd done less of as he'd grown into the version of himself that was trying to be competent and self-sufficient, because he'd learned early that it was a useful thing to be. Ethan held his hand. Good job tonight, Ethan said. I know, Lucas said, very humble. I practiced for a week. That's true. The practice was evident. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then, in the small voice he used when he was saying something he'd been thinking about for a while. Dad, do you think Mom could see it? The concert? Ethan was quiet for a second. He thought about the honest answer and the comfortable answer, and whether those were the same thing tonight. I don't know, he said. I hope so. I think she could, Lucas said. Not asking, just saying. Yeah, Ethan said. Me too. They walked the rest of the way in the December cold. Lucas's hand in his, the city doing its eternal city thing around them. And Ethan thought about what it means to lose something essential and continue forward anyway. Not because the loss stops mattering, but because continuing forward is the thing the loss requires of you, and because the people who have gone are still present in the children they leave behind, and in the choices those children make, and in the way a man reads a document at midnight with total clarity because someone taught him, early, that the world is made of language, and the language can be understood. But 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in June, Ethan arrived at the 42nd floor at 7:43, nodded to Carl in the lobby, took the elevator up, poured himself a coffee, and sat down at his desk. He had 2 agreements to review, one from a Frankfurt manufacturing firm, one from a Vienna-based financial services company. Both were at initial draft stage, which meant he was the first set of eyes on them before they went anywhere near a deal team or a board presentation. That was new, as of March. The shift from backlog review to initial review, which moved him earlier in the process and meant that the clean version of a document was partly clean because of him rather than in spite of what had happened around him. He preferred it this way, catching something before it became a problem rather than identifying it after the problem had nearly consumed everything. He opened the Frankfurt Agreement and started reading. He was on page 7 when he heard a voice behind him. Not Priya, not Grace, not Richard. A voice he didn't recognize. He turned. It was a young man, maybe 26, clearly new. He had the combination of careful suit and uncertain posture that belongs to people on their first week in a new place. He was holding a folder and looking at the desk numbering system, the way people look at numbering systems when they know they're in the right section but can't quite confirm the specific destination. "I'm looking for Ethan Brooks," he said. "That's me," Ethan said. "Oh." The young man's posture adjusted. The recalibration of expectation. "I'm James Renner. I'm starting today. Richard said you were reviewing my onboarding documents." Ethan looked at him. He remembered Richard mentioning a new hire in the German market team, someone fresh out of a European law program, strong language background, limited corporate experience. "Sit down," Ethan said. He gestured to the adjacent chair. James Renner sat down. "You're German? What's your level?" Ethan said. "Fluent, legal German specifically. I wrote my thesis on EU merger control provisions in the German regulatory framework." "What about GmbH acquisition structures?" "I know the framework. I'm less practiced on the cross-jurisdictional provisions." "That's the part that matters most," Ethan said. "The cross-jurisdictional provisions are where the language creates gaps that someone with enough sophistication can hide things in." James Renner looked at him. "Hide things like what?" Ethan turned back to the Frankfurt Agreement. He found page 7, the clause he'd been reading when James arrived, and turned the document so James could see it. "Read this clause," he said. "All of it, slowly." James read it. He was quiet for a moment, then, "The subordinate phrase, vorbehaltlich der eingetragenen Schutzrechte, that's creating a carve-out on the IP transfer." "Yes." "How easy is that to miss?" "Very easy," Ethan said. If you're reading quickly, if you're reading for the main structure and letting the subordinate clauses sit at the edge of your attention." "So you read everything," James said, "not just the main provisions." "You read everything," Ethan said, "especially the things that look like afterthoughts. Those are the places where the important decisions get made quietly." James looked at the page. The look was familiar. Ethan had felt it himself years ago, the first time he understood that legal language was not simply a system of precision, but also a system of concealment, that the same techniques that made complex agreements possible also made complex frauds possible, and that the difference between the two often came down to a single subordinate clause in the middle of a paragraph that most people were moving through too fast to read. "What am I looking for specifically?" James asked. "Pattern deviations," Ethan said. "Clauses that create scope expansions buried in limiting language. Subsidiary references to entities that don't appear elsewhere in the document. Liability provisions that redirect through undefined annexes." He paused. "You learn to feel the difference between language that is complex because the subject matter is complex, and language that is complex because someone wants you to be confused. How do you feel the difference?" You read enough clean documents, Ethan said, and then one day you read a document that isn't clean, and something in it feels wrong before you can explain why. That's the pattern recognition building itself. How long does that take? Depends on how much you read, Ethan said. James looked at him. That's a non-answer. Ethan felt the echo of it. Priya had said the same thing 6 months ago in this same chair. It's a true one, he said. Start here, page 1. I want you to flag everything that gives you pause, even if you're not sure why. We'll go through your flags together at the end of the day. James opened the document to page 1. Ethan turned back to his own screen, to the Frankfurt Agreement waiting on page 7. The floor was filling up around them, the keyboards and phones and the low, professional sound of people arriving at their work. Outside the 42nd floor windows, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan did. Going forward, always forward, indifferent to individuals and utterly dependent on them, a city that runs on the daily work of people who show up and do the thing that needs doing. He thought briefly and without grief about the version of himself that had pushed a cleaning cart through this building's corridors for 8 months. The version that had mapped this floor in the nighttime quiet, that had known the wobbly wheel and the squeaking hall and the amber standby light on the presentation screen, that had been here every night without anyone registering his presence in any way that mattered. He didn't feel superior to that version of himself. He didn't feel like that version had been diminished or wasted. That version had done what it needed to do, had kept a child fed and medicated and attended to, had shown up every night for 8 months without complaint, doing the unglamorous, essential work of keeping a building functional while other people's lives happened inside it. What he felt, mostly, was that the two versions of himself were the same person, that the man who had pushed the cart and the man who read contracts at the corner desk were built from the same materials, moved by the same things, doing, in different registers, the same essential act, showing up, paying attention, doing the work that was in front of him without requiring the work to announce its importance before he gave it his full attention. That was the thing, he thought. The thing he'd been trying to put language around since October, since Eleanor Voss had said what she'd said about the field not losing the expertise, since Lucas had said what Lucas said about not feeling invisible. The work doesn't need an audience to be real. The expertise doesn't need recognition to exist. You carry what you know inside you and it waits, patient and intact and fully itself, until the moment it's needed, and then it's simply there, and you use it, and the using of it is the whole point. He thought about every person who has sat in a room where no one could see what they were capable of. Every person who has filed their intelligence under a job title that didn't reflect it, who has gone home from work invisible in the way that Mara had said a person shouldn't have to be invisible, who has held their expertise close against their chest for years, because the circumstances of their life hadn't yet provided the room in which to set it down. He thought, those people are not invisible. They are just unseen, which is a different thing. And the difference is this. Invisible is permanent, but unseen is only a matter of time. At some point, the right door opens. Someone asked the wrong question to the right person. A boardroom crisis at 11:47 at night turns on a hinge so small it barely registers. And the man with the cart and the squeaky wheel knocks on a door and walks through it, and the room on the other side has no idea what just arrived. The Frankfurt Agreement was waiting on page 7. James Renner was on page 3 of his first document. Priya was across the floor, already deep in something, her legal pad half covered in her dense, fast handwriting. Grace was at her desk with 2 coffees again, one of which she'd set on the corner of Ethan's desk without being asked, because that was what she did now, because that was the small daily shorthand of people who have become, in the particular and limited way of colleagues who trust each other, something like known to one another. Ethan picked up his pen. He started reading. Outside, the city went on. The morning light was coming through the east-facing windows at the angle it came through in June, sharp and warm, cutting across the floor in a wide bar that moved incrementally as the hours passed. The way light moves when the world is turning in the direction it's always been turning, ordinary and ongoing, and entirely sufficient. A man who had once been invisible sat at a window desk on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, reading a German contract with a pen in his hand, and beside him a young man read his first document. And in a school 12 blocks north, a boy who knew which inhaler was the blue one was learning, this particular Tuesday morning, about rivers and where they go. They all go somewhere, rivers. That's the one thing they have in common. The source doesn't determine the destination. The path is long and narrow in places, and sometimes entirely underground, running through stone you can't see from the surface. But it keeps going, it always keeps going, and one day it arrives.